What you're looking at here is a compilation of U.S. Census data from 2010 that determines the largest self-identified ancestry of people in every American county. Now, it may be a bit hard to see, but there's a code on the side. The big ones you need to know: red for German, blue for African American, green for Irish, purple for English, that yellowish, orangish color for Hispanic, etc. Mexican in particular. But the reason I show this map is on the War Report, of course, I discuss a lot about American identity and what does being an American mean? Is it an ethnic thing? Is it an ideological thing? So I figured it would be worth it to dedicate a singular video to this, to lay it out and to say what I think American ethnic identity is and why this map looks like the way it is. We'll get into that. So, of course, the mythology, especially the post World War II mythology of American identity, is it's all about ideas. It's all about what makes us special is our various political rights, our quote unquote freedoms, etc., or our openness to the world. All this claptrap that we hear that I'm sure any of you watching this video probably don't believe in. In my opinion, it goes back down to ethnic identity. It goes back down to the founding stock of this country, which is, of course, Anglo-Saxon, Scots-Irish, and arguably limited extraction from places in northwestern Europe. Some may say French because of the influence from Louisiana and some parts along the border with Canada. Dutch, you could definitely say. But at the end of the day, I would say it's either Anglo-Saxon or Scots-Irish and the various groups that assimilated into those two cultural fronts. Now, this begs the question, what is an ethnicity? And the definition I'm going to be using just for the sake of this is ethnicity is a combination of genetic factors, where your ancestors are from, what language you speak, what cultural practices you hold. It's none of those things individually, it's a combination of all three of those things. For example, if and of course religion. Religion is another big one. For example, if a Catholic from Lebanon moved to a place like Poland, a very Catholic country in Europe, learned to speak Polish and assimilate into society, they wouldn't necessarily be Polish themselves. They, again, may be able to assimilate in society and follow their cultural customs, but I would say it comes down a lot to their genetics, their appearance, the fact that they're going to be darker skinned than your average Pole. They're just, again, going to physically stick out. Now, if you let's mix and match. Let's take two very similar ethnicities. Let's say, okay, a German Catholic goes to Poland, learns Polish, etc. Look, there'll probably be people who be like, "Oh, aren't you a German? Aren't you, etc." But at the end of the day, the German's going to have a much easier time fitting in if the German speaks fluent Polish, similar, familiar with Polish cultural practices and just everything that goes along with it. And that's, again, the definition of ethnicity I'm using for this video right here. Now, of course, there's pseudo-ethnicities. There's ethnicities that just kind of crop up out of nowhere, which I think is relevant to this because the foundational identity of America, of course, goes back to the various states. You think the 13 colonies, Pennsylvania, Virginia, New York, Georgia, the Carolinas, you name it. And really, you look at the American Revolution, you look at the governing ideology in Britain, you look at the governing ideology of the colonies, it wasn't fundamentally that much different. Now, of course, the public reasons and the reasons the American education system at least used to teach, I don't know what they teach nowadays with everything going on there, is we broke away because we were overtaxed and we didn't have any representation in the British Parliament and we wanted our freedom, and the British Crown King George was an absolute monarchist tyrant, he was a reactionary, etc. That's not entirely true. By that point, the British were a parliamentary democracy. Of course, the franchise was nowhere near the full population. Again, not that I care. It's I'm not a fan of democracy, as I'm sure all of you know. But point being is, they were both governed more or less by enlightened liberalism. Now, you could say a lot of the thought leaders of the American Revolution took it to a much greater degree, and a lot of things people on the very hard right and conservative and reactionary side will say is, well, America was founded by a bunch of Freemasons, which is true to a degree, but I mean, who do you think was running the British government at the time? Who do you think was in the Prime Minister's cabinet? Who do you think was in British Parliament? Maybe they weren't outright Freemasons, several of them probably were, but they were enlightened liberals no less. So it wasn't a battle of ideology, it was more a battle of identity. Now, you could argue people like Thomas Paine, again, for the literate population, made these ideas very palatable and very understandable to the common man, but your farmer from Georgia or your shopkeeper from Massachusetts wasn't picking up his musket and shooting at the redcoats because of what John Locke wrote 100 years prior, or any of these Enlightenment philosophers wrote throughout the Enlightenment. They did it because it was about their home, it was about their identity. They fundamentally saw themselves as more of Pennsylvanians, Virginians, Carolinians, whatever, etc., than they did British or English. Now, of course, the idea of of identifying as an American, that's more of a post-Civil War thing, especially, I would say, 20th century idea. Not that it didn't exist before that, but again, that idea comes mostly from a post-Civil War America, whereas pre-Civil War America, of course, big emphasis on the states. I mean, in fact, the first few years of this country, there was no real federal government. The Articles of Confederation, which some may argue, and I find myself sympathizing with this, may have had a better outcome for this country, but the point being is, they didn't necessarily fight because of any ideological reasons. They fought because of identity reasons. They fought because we're from Maryland, we're from Delaware, and we want to rule as the population of Maryland and Delaware and not be ruled by the British Parliament. Now, of course, that wasn't a universal sentiment. There were loyalists who fought on the British side of the Revolution. I think that goes without saying. But again, the foundation of American identity was about these religious dissidents and social outcasts who had been isolated from the homeland for about, 100 years at that point? Over 100 years? It's natural that these Puritans, that these people of these offshoot religious groups and these criminals sent into exile and these social outcasts who had no place back at home in Europe, it's natural that they were going to feel disconnect from, say, your average English Anglican or Scottish Presbyterian or whatever. And especially when you're forging a civilization out of an untamed land where the most civilization there was is some tribal groups sparsely spread throughout it. So, again, that's liable to create a new identity. And you could say, well, was it justified for the colonists' spell? Whatever. But point being is, there was enough, at least, sentiment there that they felt they were such a different people at that point. They had many of them had no problem taking up arms against their own ruling government and viewing it as more of an occupying force than their co-ethnics. But where we get into the idea of American identity and this mess of a map you're looking at right here is, so again, Civil War solidifies federal government rights over states' rights and suppresses that, suppresses a lot of the Southern identity. Southern identity still stays strong, I would say, up until about the 1960s, up until the social chaos there, whatever. But again, then you have a more unified idea of what it means to be an American. You get in the 1880s through the early 1900s, a lot of these immigrant groups coming in. Of course, there were some before. The Irish and Germans were immigrating both before and during the Civil War. That's how a lot of them got citizenship, through service in mainly the Union Army. Again, there were a few Confederate volunteers of Germans and Irish, etc. But most of the foreigners who fought basically as mercenaries fighting for citizenship, of course, fought for the Union, seeing as they were the winning side of the war. And I don't think it would ingratiate the United States federal government if you participated in a rebellion against them to give you citizenship. That's my own personal speculation, but I don't think it worked out. Now, if there are some cases of foreigners coming over here to fight for the Confederate forces and getting citizenship, I'd actually be very interested to hear about that. I'm not doubting that that happened, but that's something I'd be interested in looking more into. So if you know anything about that, put it in the comments, link me something, whatever. You know how it goes. But this is getting a little bit off track here. Which again, I like doing these off the cuff things. I don't like the script. Thing sounds too robotic. But point being is, you have this nation that has asserted itself as an American identity. Of course, as that grows, as America becomes more of a force in the world stage, so at the late 1800s and early 1900s, culminating in the World Wars, they're assimilating all these various ethnic groups where they're anglicizing their names, they're learning to speak English. Sure, they might have their ethnic communities in places like New York or Chicago or any of these major cities, these enclaves, which, again, were eventually destroyed by, what else can you say beyond social engineering, the mass movement of peoples, and again, the destructions of those communities, in my opinion, was deliberate, but that's aside the point. You have this, again, gathering of it. You have this assimilation of Americans, especially through the idea of a shared struggle, of a military struggle. Again, mainly in the form of the World Wars, where that was especially when you had a lot of Germans forcibly assimilated, and of course after that they were drafted into the military throughout both the World Wars. It created an idea of solidarity, identity. We've been through a civilizational struggle together as a nation, so we're truly one people now. And that admittedly was the basis, I would say. There was something of a solid ethnic identity there. It was based on the being an Anglophone, not necessarily an Anglo-Saxon or somebody of Anglo-Saxon descent, but somebody who speaks English, follows Anglo-Saxon, Scots-Irish cultural traditions that as they manifested on the American continent, etc., regardless of whether your heritage was German, Irish, Italian, etc. More or less, these people found a line and they followed these. And there were, of course, a few exceptions. Again, you can get into the ethnic enclaves. And especially, I would say, post World War II, there was really an idea of what it meant to be an American, and what being an American is all about. And I would say the social upheaval of the 1960s really started to deconstruct this. So it was really a ethnic identity speedrun, if you will, because it took a while to forge. And you got to remember, like, you look at the forging of ethnic identities in places in the old world like Europe and Asia. These things take centuries upon centuries. And we're talking about a country that's, again, not even 300 years old, and at that point wasn't even 200 years old. So you have all these things put together, and all of a sudden you have the basis of this national identity, but it's deconstructed as fast as it's formed. In fact, even faster, because the Cold War brings about this idea we have to be the bastion of liberalism in the world. We have to stand up to the communists, and the communists are illiberal, so we need to be the... Now, that this manifests itself in a lot of ways. You had JFK saying we're a nation of immigrants. That's where that phrase originates from. You have Reagan saying we're the shining city on the hill. And fundamentally, being an American became more about ideology than it did about what cultural customs you practice, or what's your history, or what language you speak. Because, again, in the global struggle against quote-unquote communism, we took in massive amounts of Hispanics, Cubans especially. Look at Miami. Now, Cubans are a bit funny in the case that they are actually a very strong conservative bloc, but again, these people, they still see themselves as Cubans or Cuban Americans. Not many of these people see themselves as Americans in the sense that they are exclusively Anglophone, that they identify with the history of, again, the people who built this nation. They probably identify more with their pre-communist history in Cuba, or the Vietnamese we took in after the end of the Vietnam War that settled in California. They're a solid Democratic bloc today, believe it or not. Who would have ever guessed with that one? But again, the idea that they believe in liberty and democracy and don't like communism, that became the bar to become an American. Just believe in those things and exist within the territory of the United States, and you're good to go. Speak a little bit of English, and even then, they faltered a bit on that. And of course, after the Cold War, it was the era of global liberalism, and of course, in the 80s, you had the amnesties with Reagan and even George H.W. Bush faltering on immigration. Of course, the 90s was also big. I mean, we've had an immigration crisis ongoing, I should say, nonstop since the 1980s, and again, that's how you culminate in this idea of American just being this hollow, vapid, pretty much what can only be described as a consumer identity. And I would say you look at a lot of this map, and what you see on this map is people without any roots, people who feel like being an American means nothing nowadays, because unfortunately that seems to be the case, looking at, where did my grandparents come from? Where did my great grandparents come from? I'm guilty of this. I riff on my grandfather's Italian identity all the time, and honestly, beyond my surname, which of course I'm not going to tell you here, and my appearance, look, I know a few Italian words. I would say I'm far from fluent. I can make some Italian food. I'm not the greatest. I think my dad's probably better at that. But point being is, what it means to be a hyphenated American means you got a funny last name, you might know a few funny words, and you can make some good food, or good depending on your definition. Again, I've never had. Let's look at an ethnicity on this map. I've never had a Norwegian food, but I don't imagine it's the greatest. No offense to any Norwegians out there. Maybe I will stand corrected one day. Maybe I will have some of that Scandinavian food. But I'm just saying it doesn't sound appealing to me just off the bat. But point being is, as American identity was deconstructed, it's only natural that people would look for something else, because it means nothing to be an American. It means nothing to be of any of these kind of descents. Even people are claiming their English heritage, because that's how little they have to go with. And I would say that's the inevitable result of American history, the course it went. Like I said, if things would have stayed on a different track at the end of World War II, throughout the 1960s, 70s, whatever, we might be having a different conversation today. But fundamentally, I think there's a very small time frame where an actual American identity, America as an ethnic identity, arguably a civilizational identity, could have been a thing. And like I said, that was in the early 20th century when it really started to assert itself as a real player on the world stage. But I think, again, that died out is faster than it even came about. And really, again, that's the story of many ethnicities. Many ethnicities lost time that we will never know about, because of that's just how they flare out. Except the difference is, America isn't just this isolated tribe in the middle of nowhere. It's a global superpower. Some could compare the modern American identity to what it meant to be an Ottoman, a citizen of the Ottoman Empire, or Rome, or any of these canned examples you can think. But again, it means nothing. It's a label that can be applied to anything else. I would argue a lot of Europeans are more American than Americans themselves, and I don't say that like in a derogatory way towards either, just how they culturally are, accepting these values of liberalism, democracy, etc. I would say if you're a dedicated ideological liberal, no matter where you are in the world, on some level, you are an American for better or worse, just because of what it's come to mean. The two terms, in my mind at least, and I think the mind of many people watching this channel, have become synonymous, and really I don't think there's any way to undo that. And I would say, as my advice, look, I think you should try your damnedest to reclaim American identity, because, again, this is your nation, this is your home, it's my home, and yeah, like, of course, I'm not advocating any particular course of political action. I'm not advocating any violence before anyone starts going down that rabbit hole, accusing me of things I didn't say. Not that I think any of you fine people ever would, but point being is, either that or, again, identify with some cultural block that you have a legitimate claim to, whether that be, I don't know, maybe you're Southern, maybe you're really into Dixie. Do that, or maybe you're a Cajun down from Louisiana. Do that, but point being is, the idea of being an American means fundamentally nothing nowadays, and it's a very hollow, vapid term that applies mainly to ideology, as I said, or, you know, maybe you, if you're a diaspora, maybe if you have a parent or a grandparent from a foreign country, you can try to assimilate there. Now, again, trying to assimilate just to a foreign country, especially, I don't know what level you're starting at. Again, I'm not here to recommend anything personally to you, but, I mean, just be forewarned, just because your grandparent is, say, I don't know, Polish, and your grandparents speak a little Polish, it's not like you're going to have... It's not going to be an easy process to return to your ancestral homeland and become Pole. It's going to be an uphill battle. And really, with the deconstruction of American identity for these people in ethnic limbo especially, and I'm saying this mainly for my own benefit and voicing my own internal struggle with myself, so you guys get to witness that. yeah, okay, it's going to be hard to stay within the United States and within a identityless country where, again, it's fundamentally meaningless. But it's also going to be pretty hard to assimilate yourself into a culture that you have a tenuous tie to. Not that I'm saying you shouldn't, but be forewarned. The advice of Constantine Martelli, definitely a real name there, by the way. Just be cautious and know that pretty much anything you're going to do regarding a situation like this is not going to be easy. And you know what? Best of luck to all of you. Whatever you choose to do with your lives, wherever you choose to live them, whatever identity you choose to adopt. And, there's nothing. I'm going to have to make another video about this. It seems like the only acceptable identities to have nowadays are gender and sexual. You want to talk about your ethnic heritage, whether that be founding stock American, some various European, whatever. That's off the table. You got to be LGBTQCIA. You got to identify as some third gender, whatever. But again, that's a video for a different day. And I think I'm going to get back into making these regularly, just these unscripted rants to go alongside the war report, because again, I used to make videos semi-regularly, but that kind of fell off. I know I'm getting up to like 20 something minutes here, so for all those for all of you who stuck around this long, I congratulate you, I applaud you, and I hope you gained something out of this. I hope this is insightful. So I'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.